AITAH for divorcing my husband after catching him in bed with our married neighbor and exposing her to her husband. It's strange how normal life can feel, even when you're juggling so much. I'd always prided myself on keeping it all together, balancing my marriage, my son's needs, and our little home nestled in a friendly neighborhood. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. We had our routines, our rituals, the little habits that seemed to hold everything in place. I was the kind of person who would tell anyone who asked that we were a team. My husband and I handling everything together, especially with our son, who needed extra support. Raising him has been a roller coaster of appointments, therapies, and daily challenges that can be utterly exhausting. But having a partner made it manageable, bearable even. Together, we were just strong enough. Our neighborhood added a certain calm I'd come to rely on. It's one of those places where everyone knows each other, where hellos and nods are part of everyday life. Emily, our next-door neighbor, was easygoing and friendly. Her husband, Dave, had the same low-key vibe that suited the area. My husband and I had made the move to this neighborhood precisely because it seemed like a safe place to raise our son. Somewhere he could grow up feeling supported, with friends and neighbors around who might understand the daily challenges he faces. We felt grounded, like we had put down roots in a place that could give us some relief from the stress of it all. At first, I'd thought it was nice that my husband and Emily got along well. I remember feeling a small swell of gratitude, thinking it was good that they could be friends. Dave, too, was easy to talk to, and there was never a sense of competition or rivalry between any of us. The kids would sometimes play together, and the shared sense of community only added to the peace I thought I'd found here. But then, slowly, something began to shift. It was subtle at first. My husband would have his phone more often, scrolling through it at strange hours, tucking it away when I walked into the room. I ignored it, rationalizing it as stress. Work was demanding, our son needed a lot, and our lives were complicated, so I chalked it up to him needing some space. But then there were the small errands he'd start running after dinner. The quick walks around the block, which he always seemed to take when Emily just happened to be out there too. The walks became a pattern, always in sync with hers. I caught myself questioning things more than once. It felt silly, almost irrational, to worry. After all, we'd built this life together, sacrificed for our son together, and I couldn't imagine him risking that. I told myself it was my mind, twisted by stress, making me look for problems where there weren't any. Still, there was something in the way he'd shift, how he'd look away when I caught him glancing at Emily across the yard. I would watch them chatting, sometimes laughing about who knew what, and I'd force myself to look away. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. As those tiny doubts grew, they began to gnaw at me in ways I couldn't explain. Each little change felt like a thread in the fabric of our life loosening, unspooling one by one. There's a fine line between suspicion and paranoia, and I didn't want to cross it. I needed to stay grounded, focused on what really mattered, our son, his well-being, and our family. But every glance, every whisper of a smile, or the casual moments of laughter between them echoed louder in my mind. I tried talking myself down, convinced I was just being overly sensitive. When you've been married for years, there are bound to be moments when you wonder if things are as perfect as you'd imagined. Our relationship had never been effortless, and with the added weight of raising our son, I figured a little stress was natural. But then the secrecy around his phone became more blatant. He'd check it in the middle of the night, or spend a little too long in the bathroom. And when I'd try to talk to him about his day, his answers grew shorter, like he was holding back, keeping part of himself locked away. One afternoon, I finally decided to ask him outright about it. I tried to keep it light, nonchalant, so I didn't come across as accusatory. I said something about how he and Emily seemed to have hit it off and asked if they'd been spending more time together outside of our usual gatherings. His face tightened, and he waved it off with a quick laugh, saying they'd just bumped into each other at the store once or twice. The way he dismissed it so quickly sent a chill through me. I wanted to press further, but something in his tone warned me not to. It was like he was daring me to question it, challenging me to be the jealous, paranoid wife. So I let it go. telling myself it was nothing, that I was just reading too much into everything. And yet, that voice of doubt stayed in my head, echoing through my thoughts like a haunting refrain. Every time he left the house for one of his errands, or stayed late at work without warning, the anxiety spiked. I began questioning myself, doubting my own instincts, feeling like maybe I was overreacting. I didn't want to be the kind of person who invaded someone else's privacy, who let jealousy cloud their mind. But my gut wouldn't let it go. I had no proof, no concrete evidence. All I had were these subtle shifts in his behavior and that strange intuition warning me something was wrong. Every time he smiled at me, or tried to act affectionate, I felt a sickening doubt creeping in, like a shadow cast over everything. My own insecurities, fears, and unresolved anger from our struggles as a family started to bubble to the surface. I knew I was holding on to something fragile, and that if I looked too closely, the entire thing might break apart. And yet, I wasn't prepared for the reality of what would happen next. The tipping point came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I'd planned to work late, but the school called unexpectedly to remind me of our son's half-day schedule. With a sigh, I hurriedly wrapped up my tasks and headed to pick him up, hoping my husband had remembered and wouldn't worry when he found me gone early. As I drove home with our son, I noticed how peaceful he looked, chattering about his day, oblivious to the turmoil inside me. We pulled into the driveway, and I felt a strange pang of anticipation, almost like a warning. I hadn't called or texted my husband that I'd be home early. A rare chance to catch him off guard. A subtle way to test my suspicions. I didn't really believe I'd find anything, but as I stepped out of the car, my pulse quickened, and my palms felt cold and clammy. I ushered my son inside, leaving him in the living room with his favorite show, and quietly made my way toward the bedroom. The second I cracked open the door, the image seared itself into my mind. My husband, Emily, tangled together in our bed. The very bed where we'd spent countless nights planning our lives, comforting each other, sharing in the struggles of parenting. The shock hit like a tidal wave, knocking the breath out of me. I felt paralyzed, caught between horror and disbelief. They scrambled apart, their faces flushed with panic, stammering words that didn't reach me. I backed away, not even registering what they were saying. My mind was a blur, a cacophony of emotions that I couldn't begin to untangle. Without a word, I turned and walked out, my footsteps heavy as I went back to my son, who looked up at me, blissfully unaware. Somehow, I managed to hold it together, scooping him up and taking him outside, numbly going through the motions of dropping him off at my mom's place nearby. I told her a rushed excuse, some vague mention of needing to handle something at home, hoping she didn't notice my trembling hands or my voice catching in my throat. When I returned to the house, my husband was waiting, his face a mask of shame and desperation. I barely listened as he tried to explain, stumbling over apologies, begging me to understand, to forgive. It was a mistake, he kept saying, like that could somehow erase what he'd done. I felt hollow, numb, as I heard myself telling him that I didn't care about his excuses. Whatever flimsy reasons he gave didn't matter anymore. He'd crossed a line, shattered the trust that had taken years to build. All those months of doubt, of brushing off my own instincts, now felt like a cruel joke. He had torn apart our family, fractured the foundation of our lives. I didn't see him as the man I'd married, he was a stranger. Someone who had made a mockery of everything we'd built together. In a daze, I turned my attention to Emily. She'd left in a hurry, probably rushing back to her own husband, to her own family that she'd casually put at risk. The thought gnawed at me. I couldn't let her husband live in ignorance, blind to the betrayal that had been happening right under his nose. He deserved the truth, even if it meant dragging us all into an even messier situation. The next day, I walked over to their house, heart pounding as I knocked on the door. Dave answered, his expression brightening when he saw me. That warm smile faded the second I told him I needed to talk. He looked confused, wary, but he led me inside. I sat across from him, the weight of what I was about to say pressing down on me like a vice. I could barely get the words out, my voice breaking as I recounted everything, showing him the messages, the pictures, Anything to make him see the truth. His face twisted in pain, anger, disbelief, and I knew I'd done the right thing. As much as it hurt. When I finally left, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with devastation. I'd ripped apart not only my own marriage but another family as well. It was brutal, a wound that would take years to heal. But at least it was the truth. There was no more hiding. No more pretending. The days that followed felt like walking through a field of wreckage. Every corner of my life seemed touched by what I'd uncovered. And the full reality of what I'd set in motion weighed heavily on me. My husband was beside himself, oscillating between frantic apologies and anger that I dared to expose Emily. "You could have just left it alone," he said, his voice breaking. But the idea of keeping his betrayal a secret was unimaginable. I'd made a vow to myself to always choose truth, even if it came with consequences. But that didn't make the pain any less consuming. People talk about how betrayal changes you. But I never understood how deep it cuts until now. I felt broken, raw, like a shell of the person I'd been. The worst part was how it all crept into my everyday life. Small, inconsequential things would suddenly remind me of what had happened. A casual joke about neighbors. An errant comment from a friend about loyalty. All of it became fuel for the pain simmering inside me. It seemed like every moment was a reminder of how my own home had turned into a battlefield without me even knowing. With Dave now in the picture, the fallout spread fast. Our quiet neighborhood became a breeding ground for rumors. Whispering neighbors and friends exchanging sideways glances. I felt like an exhibit on display. And though I tried to ignore it, the isolation stung. Some friends reached out, offering comfort, but the underlying judgment from others was impossible to miss. I could feel their eyes on me, questioning if I was the one who'd overreacted. If I could have somehow handled things more privately. My husband's anger only added fuel to that idea. Then there was the issue of our son. I tried my best to shield him. But he could sense the tension. The long silences. The tear-stained faces. He began asking innocent questions. Trying to understand why things felt different. Each question drove another wedge between my husband and me as I struggled to navigate how to protect our son from the chaos that had erupted around him. The heartache of watching my little boy sense the cracks in our family was almost unbearable. I felt both heartbreak and anger. Anger at my husband for selfishly dragging us into this. And at myself for not having somehow foreseen it. For failing to protect my son from the collateral damage. But I refused to retreat. I filed for divorce. And as much as my husband pleaded and tried to repair the damage, I couldn't allow him to paper over the cracks he'd created. Each step of the process felt like I was chipping away at the life we'd once shared. The separation, the lawyers, the discussions about custody, it all forced me to confront the reality of what our relationship had become. Each decision was a small release of the life we'd built. And with each step forward, I felt both freedom and loss. Emily's situation didn't fare any better. Dave had filed his own divorce papers. And though I tried to focus on my own situation, I couldn't ignore the drama unfolding next door. Every time I saw Dave, every time I caught a glimpse of Emily, a pang of sadness and bitterness hit me. We had once shared cordial exchanges, neighborly laughs, and now there was nothing but empty glances and sharp-edged silence. Dave, who had been nothing but kind, now wore the hardened look of someone who'd been betrayed deeply. Emily was a shadow of her former self. Where I used to see her smile easily, now she hurried into her car or closed the blinds at the slightest movement outside. I'd done what I believed was right. But watching the pieces of two families scatter felt strangely hollow. It was justice. But it came with a bitterness I couldn't shake. My friends were split in their reactions. Too. Some called me a hero. Someone willing to confront betrayal with honesty. Others said I'd overstepped. That I should have dealt with it in silence for the sake of our children and everyone involved. The clash of opinions was almost deafening. And in those moments, I felt like I'd lost my own sense of right and wrong. But each time I doubted, I reminded myself of that afternoon, of the hurt I'd felt. The humiliation, and the betrayal, and I knew that silence would have been the far greater injustice. In the weeks that followed, guilt lingered like an unwelcome guest in every room of my life. There were days when I'd wake up feeling strangely weightless. The initial shock of betrayal replaced by something quieter, emptier, and then there were days when the full gravity of everything hit me. When I questioned every step I'd taken and the fallout it left behind. I tried to remind myself of why I'd confronted Dave, why I'd refused to stay silent. But the guilt still haunted me. My husband was still living in the house, though in the guest room now, trying to patch up whatever remained of our fractured marriage. He went from apologetic to defensive, a pendulum swinging between anger and sorrow. We could have figured this out for the sake of our family, he'd say, only to backtrack and beg for forgiveness. But each time he pleaded, I felt more and more like a stranger in my own marriage. With every desperate word he spoke widening the chasm between us, I knew that staying with him would only mean denying my own self-worth. That any foundation we'd built had crumbled to dust. And my son, I could see the effects on him, too. His innocent eyes, once full of pure love and trust, now carried a heaviness I hadn't noticed before. He'd watch me more closely, sensing my sadness, feeling the strain in our home. I tried to mask it, to keep up a facade for his sake. But children are perceptive in ways we often don't acknowledge. He'd ask questions with a quiet earnestness, his words piercing in their simplicity. Why is Daddy not staying in your room anymore? Will we always live here, Mom? Each question was a reminder of the stable life we'd once had and the chaos that had taken its place. With the neighborhood watching, the judgment from those around us only amplified the guilt I felt. There were whispers, sidelong glances from neighbors who once greeted me warmly. Some offered support, but there was a divide, a rift in the small community we'd once belonged to. Every time I left the house, I felt the weight of their opinions, each person seemingly siding either with me for bravely confronting the truth, or with my husband, accusing me of tearing apart families unnecessarily. It was exhausting and isolating, a reality I hadn't anticipated when I'd chosen to confront the situation openly. Amid all of it, Dave became my reluctant ally. Though we didn't talk often, the few times we crossed paths, there was an unspoken understanding between us. I saw him one afternoon. His shoulders stooped, eyes shadowed. We exchanged a few quiet words, and he thanked me again for telling him the truth. In that moment, I felt a flicker of validation, a reminder that while the fallout had been painful, honesty had freed us both from the lies. Dave was taking his own steps forward, and seeing him navigate his life, shattered as it was, gave me a sense of purpose in my own decision. My husband didn't see it that way. He clung to the idea that we could have just moved on, pretended like nothing happened, and stayed together for the sake of our son. He kept saying I'd given up too easily, that I was selfish for tearing us apart over one mistake. But his words only solidified my resolve. Staying would mean living with a constant reminder of betrayal, silencing my own needs and pain for a semblance of normalcy. And deep down, I knew that was no life for me, or for our son. I had to choose the kind of strength that came from letting go, from walking away from what no longer served me. In the midst of all of this, I began to feel the first inklings of freedom. I started thinking of what my life would look like on my own. The prospect both terrifying and liberating. I was terrified of the unknown, of starting over with a child and rebuilding a life from scratch. Yet there was a strange exhilaration in it too. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to envision a life without the constraints of betrayal, lies, and compromise. It wasn't going to be easy, but there was strength in knowing I had made the right choice, even if others couldn't understand it. Slowly, my son and I found a new rhythm together. I poured my energy into our days, creating routines that felt stable, safe. We went for walks, spent afternoons in the park, and I found myself rediscovering the joys of simplicity. The heartbreak was still there, raw and ever-present, but there was also resilience. It was as though each day, I was gathering fragments of myself, piecing them back together in a new way. And in those quiet moments with my son, I knew that while our family might look different now, we would be okay. After weeks of tumult and tension, the decision to move forward with a divorce felt like both a release and a sentence. It's hard to describe the feeling of watching a life you carefully built come undone. Layer by layer. One day, you're in the thick of routine, making dinner plans, organizing school drop-offs, and sharing whispers in the dark with someone you trust. The next, you're in lawyer meetings, drafting custody agreements, and meticulously dividing everything from bank accounts to vacation photos, knowing there's no going back. I could feel the weight of it in every room of our home. In the shared spaces that now felt hollow. The kitchen, where I'd once enjoyed experimenting with recipes while my husband laughed over a glass of wine, now seemed cold and clinical. The countertops wiped clean of warmth and intimacy. The living room, where our son used to snuggle between us on movie nights, now felt like an empty stage. The echoes of our laughter long gone. And our bedroom? I couldn't even bring myself to go in there anymore. A space now marked by betrayal rather than comfort. In every corner, I saw what we once had, and the sharp reality of its absence. Filing for divorce was its own brand of emotional chaos. I never imagined the complicated entanglement of legal proceedings, the decisions that had to be made, or the forms that seemed endless. Each document I signed, each line I initialed, felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage. Our friends, once so warm and supportive, now seemed wary and uncertain. Some reached out, offering support and promises of friendship. Others quietly retreated, as though fearing the fallout would spill over into their lives. But through it all, I felt a strange determination harden within me, a desire to reclaim myself and build something solid for my son and me. My husband's response was a mix of anger, sadness, and denial. In moments of clarity, he'd admit his wrongs, pleading for another chance, insisting he could change. But in other moments, his frustration seeped through, especially when it came to the division of our lives. He felt wronged, believing I was giving up too quickly, unwilling to fight for us. But the way I saw it, he'd already done the damage, already taken a sledgehammer to the foundation of trust we'd built. Fighting for us meant pretending this betrayal never happened, sweeping it under the rug, and pretending everything was fine, and I knew that I couldn't do that. Meanwhile, Emily and her husband, Dave, were undergoing their own struggles. I'd heard from mutual friends that Dave had moved out, taking some time to process everything and consider his own future. There was a strange solidarity between us now, Dave and me, as though we were unwilling players in the same sad, twisted game. I saw him once when he was visiting some friends nearby, and we shared a brief, understanding nod. It was clear we were both on the same journey, each grappling with our own heartbreak and betrayal. Somehow, that small acknowledgement, that moment of shared pain, was grounding. The impact of everything rippled through my days, each small decision reminding me of the larger, painful reality. I started avoiding certain places in town, spots where I knew Emily and her family often went. Our neighborhood grocery store felt like a minefield, each aisle carrying the risk of an awkward encounter or a knowing glance from another neighbor. Our favorite park became off-limits, memories of weekend outings tainting what had once been a haven of peace. It felt like losing not just my husband but the whole neighborhood. The sense of community that had once been so comforting. In those weeks, I poured everything into my son, giving him the stability I so desperately craved. His routine became my anchor. Mornings spent getting him ready for school. Afternoons devoted to homework and activities. And nights filled with stories and quiet moments. He sensed something was changing but accepted my explanations with a child's remarkable resilience. I knew this upheaval was hard on him, too. Yet in every hug, every sleepy, good night, Mom, I found a strength I didn't know I had. His trust, his belief in me, kept me moving forward, one day at a time. The emotional toll was intense. There were nights when I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, questions swirling in my mind. Was I overreacting? Could I have handled things differently? Was I truly prepared for this new life? The doubts crept in quietly, casting shadows over my resolve. But each time they did, I reminded myself of that day, the betrayal, the lies, the secrets, and I knew I'd made the only choice that allowed me to respect myself. So, I kept pressing forward, doing my best to untangle the web of my marriage while building something new for my son and me. The uncertainty of it all loomed large, but beneath it was a quiet determination, a belief that this pain, however consuming, would eventually lead to something better. That, in this fresh start, There would be room for healing. For growth. For the kind of love that wasn't tainted by deceit. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find my way back to peace. In the days that followed, it became clear that our decision to separate, and the way it came about, had stirred up more than just our home. The news traveled through the neighborhood with an intensity I hadn't expected. At the grocery store, I felt the weight of strangers' eyes on me, as if I'd become the subject of some local scandal. Even the cashier I'd chatted with for years looked at me differently. As though I'd betrayed some silent social code by tearing open the facade of our idyllic street. People's reactions were surprising, and often disappointing. I'd never imagined my neighbors' loyalty to the illusion of a perfect community would be more important than understanding the hurt and betrayal I was grappling with. It was as if by exposing the affair, by confronting Emily and telling Dave, I'd crossed some unspoken line. A few of the people I thought I could trust openly disapproved, suggesting I could have handled it with more grace, more discretion. Their disapproval simmered beneath polite smiles, leaving me to feel like the villain in a story I never wanted to be part of. Mutual friends were equally divided. Some texted, calling me brave and strong, offering words of support that felt like thin patches over a wound too deep to cover. But others were critical, openly telling me they thought I'd been too rash, too quick to throw everything away without trying harder to save the family. They didn't see the sleepless nights I'd endured, the endless attempts at therapy, or the countless times I'd given my husband the benefit of the doubt. To them, the affair was a bump in the road, not a betrayal that shattered my trust completely. They thought I could have quietly taken care of things, rather than involving Emily's husband, Dave. But could I have really kept it quiet? Was it really possible to bear the knowledge of such betrayal in silence? Living every day with that poison within me? I kept replaying their words, questioning myself and wondering if I'd made the right choice. I started doubting if maybe, just maybe, I had blown things out of proportion. Yet each time those thoughts arose, I'd remember the cold shock of walking into my own bedroom and seeing my husband and Emily together. An image burned so deeply into my mind that it eclipsed any rationalization I could try to build around it. As the weeks passed, the judgment didn't seem to let up. Friends who had always been close grew distant, their own discomfort evident. Invitations for gatherings disappeared, replaced by awkward silence or lukewarm excuses. It seemed everyone in the neighborhood had formed their own opinion, and very few people seemed to grasp the emotional turmoil I was going through. I was forced to navigate the daily reminders of a life unraveling. And each glance, each whisper, compounded the loneliness of my decision. Emily's reaction added fuel to the fire. Too, despite everything, she managed to paint herself as a victim, spreading stories about how I'd blown things out of proportion and ruined her marriage. Somehow, she twisted the story until she seemed more like a wronged party than an active participant in the betrayal. In our small community, where people love to think the best of their neighbors, her narrative held some weight. She emphasized that it wasn't serious, and that I had been too reactive, shifting blame away from herself and onto my supposed lack of composure. It was infuriating, knowing that she could deflect her role so easily while I bore the brunt of the fallout. Yet, there were small pockets of solace. A few close friends didn't flinch, and they provided the support I desperately needed. They'd come over on quiet afternoons, offering tea and a steady presence. And I clung to those moments, grateful for their compassion. In those brief respites, I didn't feel like I had to defend myself, didn't feel like I had to explain my anger or justify my decision. They understood the hurt and betrayal I felt without needing a word of explanation. They knew that what I was going through wasn't simply an overreaction, it was the grief of losing the life I thought I had. Still, the isolation of it all was suffocating. Even the familiar spaces in my own home felt tainted, memories slipping through my mind like ghosts. I'd stand in the kitchen, remembering family dinners, the laughter and shared moments that had once filled the room. Now, those same walls bore silent witness to the betrayal that had broken everything apart. The house felt empty, even when my son and I were both there, as if its very foundation had been shaken. In the quiet moments, I'd catch myself wondering if there was a way to undo it all. To rewind to a time when ignorance had been my shield. But that was a lie. 2. I knew. Ignorance hadn't been bliss, it had been a bubble. One that burst and left me raw and exposed. Forced to face the reality I'd once thought I could trust. Through the long days, I focused on rebuilding, putting one foot in front of the other and learning to trust myself again. It was a slow, painful process, but I knew that in every step forward, I was moving toward a life grounded in truth. However brutal that truth may have been, I wasn't just rebuilding for myself, I was doing it for my son. Creating a future where he could grow up in a world with integrity, free from deception. And so, despite the whispers, despite the judgment, I chose to keep moving forward, knowing that the only validation I truly needed was my own. I may have been labeled the villain in a story others wanted to twist and simplify. But deep down, I understood that I was simply doing what was necessary to reclaim my life. And that, no matter what anyone else believed, was something I would never regret. Once I filed for divorce, everything about my marriage, my home, and even the community felt like a string of loose ends. The finality was jarring, and the reality of it was settling in deeper each day. My husband and I had created a world together, but now I was left to pick up the pieces alone. And somehow, I had to make it all make sense for myself and for my son. It was a heavy task, especially as I watched him move in and out of the house with half-hearted attempts to win me back. Attempts that were as feeble as they were frustrating. He tried flowers. He'd once joked that I loved them more than him, always filling our home with fresh arrangements to brighten the rooms. But now they just felt like a taunting reminder of how often he'd brought those flowers home after being with her. Each petal seemed to hold an echo of betrayal, and I'd drop them in the trash, one after another, feeling a little bit lighter with each discarded stem. Apologies, explanations, and promises for a fresh start, he cycled through them all. Every one of them landing hollow, each revealing just how deeply he'd missed the point. I knew he wanted forgiveness. Not for me but to relieve his own guilt. I could see that now, clear as day. His apologies weren't about healing the wound, they were about pretending it hadn't been inflicted in the first place. Forgiveness in his eyes was like a reset button, one that he thought would let him keep everything intact, our family, our reputation, our life. But I knew better. Even if forgiveness was something I'd someday find in myself, it wouldn't erase the pain or the memory. It wouldn't make what happened disappear. Emily's husband, Dave, filed for divorce shortly after I did. And somehow that only complicated things further. She made it known to everyone that I was to blame. That my revelation had ruined what she described as a perfectly happy family. She ignored her own choices, the deceit, and the lies that she and my husband had built together. To her, the problem wasn't the betrayal, it was the exposure. The audacity of that realization was almost laughable. It's as if they thought their lie had a right to live as long as they wanted it to, regardless of the collateral damage it caused. I kept my interactions with my husband to the minimum, discussing only necessary matters about our son or the logistics of the divorce. There was no space for anything else. The man I'd married, the person I'd once seen as my partner, my confidant, he was gone. Replaced by a stranger who didn't even seem to understand why he'd destroyed everything we had. It hurt deeply to see that lack of understanding. To know that he could burn our life to the ground and yet still stand there, asking for forgiveness with no grasp of the damage he'd done. I'll never forget the day he came over to pick up a few things he'd left. Our son was at school, and I was grateful for the silence. He'd shown up, this time with a look of genuine desperation in his eyes. He talked about change, therapy, promises to become a better man. I was stone-faced, a stillness inside me I didn't even know I had. For so long, I'd held myself together, fending off my own pain for the sake of stability. But at that moment, I finally felt calm, like I'd reached a place beyond hurt. I told him it was over, that there was no version of this life where I'd ever return to what we had. I explained that trust was a fragile thing, built over years and shattered in seconds, and that once broken, it could never be restored to its original state. I looked at him, seeing the man I once loved but also the man he'd revealed himself to be. I could see the remorse, the regret, but it didn't stir anything within me anymore. I didn't hate him, I just didn't love him either. There was simply nothing. As he left, I felt a strange sense of relief. Like a weight had finally been lifted. The house was still, quiet, but it was my quiet now. My peace. I knew there would be difficult days ahead. But I also knew that I was strong enough to face them. I was starting over, not with bitterness but with a renewed sense of purpose. A fresh canvas upon which I could build a life grounded in truth, resilience, and, above all, self-respect. The chapter with him had ended. And though it was a painful story, it was one I'd finally closed. Once and for all. As the divorce process moved forward, life took on an unfamiliar rhythm. My days were split between my responsibilities as a mother and figuring out what my new identity would be as a single woman. I'd spent so long defining myself by the roles of wife and mother. And it felt strange to consider who I was beyond that. But this self-discovery felt as much a necessity as it was an opportunity. Being alone felt both liberating and lonely. Evenings became a time of quiet contemplation. When my son was asleep, the silence would settle around me. And instead of feeling empty, I began to let it fill me up. I thought about everything I'd sacrificed over the years, the dreams I had set aside, and the parts of me I'd neglected to keep my marriage afloat. Slowly, I began to reclaim pieces of myself. Small things that felt like they were part of the me that existed before all of this, the me who was independent, driven, and hopeful. My son was a constant anchor through it all. And I saw myself in a new light as his mother. He was dealing with this transition, too, perhaps more than I was. And I knew it was crucial to be his safe harbor through all the stormy changes. We spent more time together, quiet, grounding moments that pulled me back to the present, reminding me of the life we still had and the love that hadn't disappeared. Even if it had changed forms, our bond grew in ways I couldn't have predicted. I saw his resilience, his capacity for understanding, and that helped me believe in my own resilience, too. Every time my husband came by to pick up our son, I felt the tiniest ripple of residual anger. But I didn't let it take root. I learned to let him exist in his own world, separate from mine. The boundaries became firm, but the bitterness waned. I refused to give him any more power over my emotions or my peace of mind. It wasn't easy, but with every encounter, I could feel myself growing stronger, stepping further away from the shadow he'd cast over my life. Emily, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. She'd moved out of her home, leaving Dave to pick up his own pieces. Sometimes I felt pangs of guilt for blowing up her life. But they never lingered long. I reminded myself that her choices, like my husband's, had led her here. I hadn't shattered anything for her. I'd simply illuminated what was already broken. Dave had reached out to me a few times in the beginning. And while I was initially hesitant, we ended up meeting for coffee once or twice, sharing a sort of camaraderie born out of betrayal. Our conversations were a balm for both of us, an acknowledgement of shared pain and a desire to move forward without carrying that pain as baggage. He told me he was considering moving out of the neighborhood altogether, seeking a fresh start somewhere away from the memories that house held. I understood, but I decided to stay. This was my home, my son's home, and I wouldn't let what they did take that from us. Over time, I learned to navigate the delicate balance between detaching from the past and building toward the future. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from over the years. Friends who reminded me that life didn't have to be defined by marriage, motherhood, or heartbreak. I even tried new hobbies. Things I'd always told myself I didn't have time for: painting, running, learning to cook new recipes. They were small things, but each one was a reminder that I was more than the roles I'd once assumed. Looking back, I realized how long I'd lived under the illusion that my husband's love was essential to my happiness. As if I were a secondary character in his story rather than the protagonist of my own. This new phase was a reckoning. An awakening that I didn't need him, or anyone, to define my worth or fulfill my happiness. I saw that my own joy, my peace, and my identity were mine alone to shape. And that truth was worth every painful step that had brought me here. In a way, I owed a strange gratitude to the betrayal, to the upheaval. I was learning what it meant to love myself without reservation, to value my own peace more than anyone else's approval. The new normal was no longer about survival or resilience, it was about truly living. The decision to divorce had felt monumental. A shattering of the life I thought I'd built for myself. But as the months passed, I found myself adapting, not just surviving but growing stronger. Even thriving. I hadn't anticipated the way life would open up once I let go of everything I had clung to so tightly. And that's what struck me the most, how much lighter I felt now. Free from the web of secrets, lies, and resentment that had quietly crept into every corner of my life. Our divorce finalized quietly, almost anticlimactically. The paperwork was filed, the signatures inked, and with that, my marriage was legally over. A chapter had closed, but I'd come to see that it was just one chapter in a much larger story. As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of sadness and exhilaration. It was painful to let go, but there was also something incredibly liberating about stepping into the unknown on my own terms. I poured my energy into my career, which had always been fulfilling but had taken a backseat for far too long. I found myself getting promoted, recognized for projects I'd spearheaded, and enjoying a sense of pride in my work that felt new. It was as though, for the first time, I was fully invested in my own life, building something that was mine alone, not tied to anyone else's expectations or needs. My relationship with my son flourished too. We had always been close, but the change brought us even closer. He was young, and though he didn't fully grasp the complexities of what had happened, he understood that things were different. He adapted to our new life with a resilience that inspired me. And I worked hard to be the constant for him, to be the unwavering support he needed. Our little routines became sacred, the bedtime stories, weekend adventures, and even the quiet moments over breakfast. It was in these small things that I found purpose, a grounding force that made all the upheaval worth it. Over time, I began to heal. There were still moments when the past crept back in, brief shadows that reminded me of what had been lost. But they came less frequently, fading like scars that had healed over. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined me. I could look back without bitterness, only a kind of acceptance. What happened would always be a part of my story, but it didn't have to be the defining part. As for Emily and my ex-husband, I heard little about them after the dust settled. They'd each gone their separate ways. And though the memories occasionally stirred something in me, I'd learned to leave them in the past where they belonged. I didn't wish them ill anymore. Didn't even feel anger. Life was moving forward, and I was too. One evening, as I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, I realized how far I'd come. I wasn't the same person who had once walked in on a betrayal that tore her world apart. I had found strength I hadn't known I possessed. A fierce independence that allowed me to stand alone and feel whole. I knew now that I could weather whatever life threw my way. I hadn't just survived the storm, I had grown through it, learned from it, and emerged as someone stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than I ever thought I could be. Moving forward, I knew life would still bring its challenges, but I was ready, grounded in a newfound confidence and a deep trust in myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, looking toward the future with a sense of hope and possibility that I hadn't felt in years. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, I knew that I would be okay.